So one of the most amazing things about my job as an investigative journalist is how easy it is to detect investment fraud. You know, I can tell within seconds, typically, of looking at something whether it's fraudulent or not, and then it takes a lot longer to do the research and find out the names of the people involved in order to write a substantial article and find out the names of the providers so I can put as much detail in as possible. But actually detecting the fraud is easy. And yet, you know, I know of no other type of criminal activity that swindles so many people out of so much money on an annual basis. And I can understand why investors, you know, lose money because they typically don't do any due diligence. If they like somebody, they tend to trust them. I do find it, though, surprising that so many professional service providers, you know, provide services to schemes that, you know, are often just, you know, not particularly sophisticated, and they leave themselves open to tremendous liability. So we're going to have a discussion about, you know, I've asked the panelists to sort of, after putting on quite a few of these types of sessions, I realized that we were putting them on for individual investors, and they really weren't coming to the conference, and they weren't really interested in the subject matter. So I've asked the panelists to sort of try as much as possible to sort of focus on the addressing some issues that relate to professional service providers, and, you know, with the aim of sort of reducing their liability, because, you know, they're you know, likely to be on the hook for some serious reputational and financial damages when investment frauds inevitably collapse. So to my immediate right is Carlo Fedrigoli, who is an Italian attorney based in Dubai, and he specializes in fraud investigations. And Carlo and I have had a few telephone conversations, and we're clearly on the same wavelength when it, you know, comes to fraud and, you know, understanding it. And to his right is James Pomeroy, who's based in Canada, and he specializes in forensic investigations for PwC. So James is going to kick off for 20 minutes or so. Then Carlo is going to speak for 20 minutes or so, and if there's any time left over, I'll fill in any gaps, and we'll take some questions. So, James?
Thanks, David. So, Mike, as David mentioned, I'm going to try and focus on some of these red flags that you see that are common hallmarks of investment fraud as they relate to service providers. Some of these may, you know, may be more attributable to what an investor may look for, but really, it's just an amalgamation of sort of my observations of about a dozen years of liquidating offshore banks and in investigating offshore investment vehicles. I'm not going to comment on, you know, the whether OFCs are good or bad. These are just things that I've seen during the course of my my career. The first one, and this one certainly does go to regulators. Lack of financial statements or delay in filing of financial statements. Really need to ask why. What's the problem? Is it an issue with you know, with the asset base, the portfolio? Is there a problem with the auditor? Will the auditor not be able to sign an unqualified opinion? It's really something that should be of a concern for certainly for regulators or anyone dealing with offshore investment vehicles. Cash flow issues, obviously, are cash flow demands for any company can be a concern. For an investment fund or any investment vehicle, especially a fraudulent one, they're obviously much more of a consideration. Investment operators, investment fund operators are always looking for new sources of cash flow, and they may offer incentives to existing investors to roll their investments. It reduces the demand on the cash flow. I just want to, this is a quote from a message to investor, or it's actually an internal message between the operator of an investment fund and his people. It's quite telling. And it reads, "We had about 8 new strong leads on Friday with an investment equivalent of $100,000 for each victim. It's a worthwhile activity, albeit extremely long term. With 20 in the bag and another 80 in our sights, it would be a source of comfort once and if our negative cash flow problem is surmounted. Our current investment total is almost $60 million, and it creates a liability of close to $500,000 a month, of which we're covering half." So they're actively out there hunting for new investors. So when the cash flow does tip, you know, obviously the easy way out is for a suspension of payments, and that's going to try and buy some time for the investment operator. In many of the offshore investment schemes that I've looked at, they're typically, or can often be based on tax avoidance. So the case up on the screen is a pretty complex scheme that was promoted to investors. It was based on some anti-tax theories that were being promoted. The proponents of some of these tax schemes are often members of these anti-government groups, or like free men on the land, sovereign citizens groups that come up with these theories. One of the ones that I've encountered in the past is the Free Men on the Land Society, and you can see what these groups try to do is distinguish themselves from the government, from their artificial self, from their natural self. So there's a movement among these different groups at a high level to distinguish their natural self from the artificial self that the groups claim exist. They often respond to legal challenges from asset recovery efforts by flooding the court with manifestos and documents that just boggle the court's mind. Another common thread that you see is secrecy and privacy. And I'm not talking about the sort of the standard of secrecy and privacy that one would expect for any investment, but it's a concerted effort towards superfluous privacy. And so they use things like privacy-oriented mail, which is promoted as having built-in data encryption, is housed offshore, and it goes over and above your Yahoo Mail, your Hotmail. The foundations of many of these programs often espouse the privacy and confidentiality of the investment opportunity itself. Many programs are by invitation only, which may be another attempt to avoid securities regulators. And account documents may contain very strict confidentiality language. Account agreements may contain privacy language that discourages investors from seeking outside advice or reporting to regulators or law enforcement if things do go wrong. And I've encountered some not so subtle and not so sophisticated attempts at privacy or secrecy, and these are some code words that I obtained or found when reviewing emails. And the one that I quite like is, the professor says that the bank wants to send us another infusion of Twinkies, about half as many as the original carton. I told him, okay, we're gluttons for good Twinkies. So not exactly sophisticated. The next topic I want to mention is avoidance of the traditional financial system. So I'm referring partly to efforts by promoters to offer investors special or non-traditional investment opportunities, but also the use of alternative means of actually placing the investment funds and to move those funds from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. While wire transfers and old-fashioned checks are still quite common, the use of money transfer agents, e-gold, and electronic currencies are becoming more and more frequent. especially for those groups like the free man on the land, the sovereign citizen groups, who are skeptical of government and financial institutions. The examples I've got up on the screen give investors various options for investing their money, including cash and e-gold. And e-gold is sort of a precursor to these digital currencies like you're finding with Bitcoin. It's going to be interesting to see how Bitcoin and other digital currencies are going to impact asset tracing efforts in the future. Another hallmark that I've encountered is the offering of special or private access to investors. So this slide is an image taken from the hard drives of a roughly $60 million Forex Ponzi scheme. It shows one of the investment administrators with his special contact on the trading floor of a large international bank headquartered in Asia. Presumably the advantage to the fund was that it enabled a relatively small player to access the volume and scale of institutional markets, but it was never exactly clear what this special access provided. This was promoted to the unsophisticated investors as a way to be able to play in the big leagues. In this case, the access was so private that the principal claims he never had a signing authority or visibility into the account whatsoever. And I think the claims of private access or special access to investment opportunities it can simply be seen as the age-old limited time only sales pitch that is intended to encourage fence sitters to commit. Certainly, fully insured or guaranteed returns are something you're going to find. On the screen is an example from Grenada where the bank claimed that its deposits were covered by the International Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the IDIC. So note the acronym IDIC, which was used throughout the group's promotional material, and its resemblance to FDIC or CDIC, the US and Canadian government entities that insure deposits for each of those countries. So this was by design and intended to give that air of comfort and legitimacy to the operation. The example on screen is an excerpt from a document prepared by the principal of an offshore bank out of Dominica. This was used to launder investors' funds from two Ponzi schemes, one in the US, one in the UK. What's notable is the reference to the bank's investment in A-plus rated bond syndication and the description of the absolute safety of investors' principal at all times, and the comment that because of the investment policy, this very safe and conservative one, it would be very hard to find a more conservative bank investment policy. So the point is, it's easy to put these things out there. It's easy to put out a brochure or write a letter that says that you're fully insured or your investments are all AAA rated. But if you're doing any kind of business with any of these types of organizations, you really need to exercise some due diligence and some skepticism. Certainly, excessive rates of return are common, and flawless win rates are also a common feature of these schemes. So on the screen there, it shows the interest rate being offered by a program that we wound up in Canada was 20% a month. So in the example on the screen, they can actually see there's a 15% bonus being taken out of this investor's first month, and that was intended to pay the referral fee or the pyramid fee to the person who brought him in. So still not a bad year. He invested $11,000, and by the end of the year it was worth close to $90,000. So inordinate win rates, that's another feature. So in these are a couple of updates to investors from the TradeX Forex scheme. So here we see claims of another great month and another great year. The update boasted transactional win rates. These were foreign currency trades of 80% and a 7-year history with no losing months. So I wanted to find some statistics today, so I did a little search and I found that there was actually a company that was about to list an IPO this week that had a 99% win rate. But when I looked a little closer, this wasn't just a boast. It was a high-frequency trader. So these guys use computer algorithms to do high-frequency trading on large-cap entities, and they're trading in milliseconds, and they're capitalizing on a very minor spread. So that's a little more sophisticated and not what I'm getting at. So The example on the screen, the foreign currency trader was actually, I think her training had been in phlebotomy, which is blood taking, and she had no financial background or any training. Her only real connection to the foreign currency trading was her special access to the trading floor through her brother, apparently. So unusual and complex structures. Mentioned earlier about the use of complex structures that may be offered to avoid tax, but you also see complex operational structures that are often designed to give separation between the investment promoter, the investors, the investing activity, bank accounts, regulators, cash cards, etc. So the example on the screen involved a Canadian investment promoter operating a Panamanian company, accessing Canadian investors and their money. They would send that money to a bank in Curacao, and from there the operator had the ability to move the money around the world, which he did, moving it from Curacao to bogus investments in the U.S., to personal bank accounts in Hong Kong, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, and also to credit card accounts in New Zealand and Australia. And ultimately the goal was to loop a lot of that money back to Canada in the form of cash withdrawals, both by investors and the promoter himself, using credit cards that were linked to the fund. And of course, investor money drips away at every turn, and which again goes to the demand for cash flow. Affinity fraud, I'm sure everybody's heard of it. Affinity fraud exploits the trust and friendships that exist in groups of people who have something in common. The TradeX Forex fraud that I mentioned a moment ago was aimed not specifically at a single community or denomination of church group, but was targeted at a number of different faithful and a variety of religious and spiritual groups. What many of the investors had in common was their spiritual faith and a natural trust of people. The members of these groups also have an inherent trust for each other, and this helps to grow the investor base as the word of mouth spreads. The affinity connection can also help maintain secrecy when things go wrong and investors have lost their money. They'll often remain loyal to each other and to the operators of the group, and they don't want to betray any of that. So oftentimes the affinity helps to it prevents victims from reaching out or speaking with law enforcement or liquidators. The result of the complex operational structures and tax schemes that I mentioned earlier often bear out as complex funds flows. Granted, this detail might not become available until the asset recovery stage or the liquidation stage is in process. But this is an example of TradeX where it accounts for approximately $60 million of money that came in from about 500 victims. The operator opened accounts in probably 8 or 10 jurisdictions and moved money throughout. So this is sort of the high level, and each one of those nodes would give rise to another analysis and another similar chart. So rollover of past failures, another common feature. The one on the screen is a third or fourth generation rollover. So it started out as something called Freeland Ops, and which failed in 2004 or 2005. The operator of that fund rolled the investors from that fund into his new company, Jabez Holdings SA, out of Panama, which failed less than a year later. And so this was a pattern. We actually were liquidating and recovering the assets for Jabez Financial Services Inc., the third one down the chain, and when the money ran out, and as I mentioned before, some of the victims who were reluctant to speak to us got simply rolled over into the fourth generation, which was an offshore bank that the gentleman set up from Panama in New Zealand, I believe it was. Economic naturalization. So this is something I've seen in a number of cases. Where I've seen it, it's been used to avoid taxation or to provide some separation from the home jurisdiction. And I haven't had any experience yet where this tactic has been helpful. I don't know if anybody else has. but when it comes time for the asset recovery phase, the asset or the economic naturalization did nothing for the operator. So the last item that I want to mention is suspect or unusual assets and investments. Investment frauds can often deviate from their stated investment mandate. What's marketed as foreign currency trading can wind up as investments in other Ponzi schemes, real estate, or very speculative ventures such as mines or different types of investments. In the case on the screen there is what was supposed to be a foreign currency trading investment program. It invested in, I think it's a coin collection, a $150,000 coin, and a bentonite mine that is purportedly worth $447 billion if you were to exploit it fully. So a little bit questionable. So it's important for investors and service providers to understand what the real asset base is, if there really is one, and to be skeptical of claims that seem to be too good to be true. So many of the red flags are more easily noticed with the benefit of hindsight, but to protect ourselves, we need to apply somewhat of a skeptical lens when we evaluate investment offerings and the people promoting them. So doing some degree of due diligence at the front end can protect you when things go badly. So with that, I'll pass it over to Rick.
Good. Well, I came all the way from Dubai, actually, to give you a Dubai perspective of this global regulatory arbitrage that we face and situation that we face when we analyze investment fraud. And my Dubai perspective is that I see a number of trends and patterns that, in my view, are in most part not known and clear to the offshore markets, particularly in the Caribbean. A lot of the structure do have a Caribbean offshore component, but what I see on my side of the world is other parts of the food chain. The most interesting, possibly, is that Dubai and other expat markets have become, in the last few years, one of the preferred target location for distribution and marketing of dubious or sometimes fraudulent schemes, and that's the part of the food chain that I would like to analyze primarily in this session. There are, of course, patterns and elements that overlap what you just covered, but I think there is something that is not necessarily repeating what the interesting thing that you say. So in my analysis, and actually is an analysis which is mainly based on web and open sources, and I can suggest to you how to find out this information. I have noticed for the last 3-4 years that many of the fraudulent schemes that many of those that David has unveiled actually are sold mainly in places like Hong Kong, Dubai, Thailand, Singapore, south of Spain, Cyprus, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. There are upcoming target markets. The way these the upcoming markets, as the one that I mentioned earlier, are all characterized by fast-growing expat communities, and normally what you could probably define as an affinity element. The expat communities are often looking for a place where to put their money, because they feel that the jurisdiction where they're working are not fully protected. They feel that they might move soon. They don't feel confident to keep the money in the same place where they live. And out of many products that are often proposed to expats, there are offshore wraps or life insurance structures. Many of them, of course, offshore, many of them based in the Channel Islands, and many of them host a lot of these funds that are sold to investors. The target expat market offer quite an attractive as a magnet almost for promoters of these funds, because they have extremely poor regulatory frameworks for funds marketing. There is a language barrier that often make it very difficult or sometimes impossible for the local enforcement agents to understand the promotional material, to understand the subtle language and the way in which the promotional material is circulated into these jurisdictions. And in fact, in places like Dubai, where there are, of course, large English-speaking community, but also Filipino or Indian or Indonesian communities, you will have marketing material in different languages that a local Arab-speaking enforcement agent will not even understand. The local regulatory framework is in most cases focused on the citizens, and this is what somehow leaves the expat unprotected. These, together with a general lack of enforcement on cold calling and high-pressure sales practice, leaves basically an almost open market for marketing fraudulent structures. And in fact, a lot of the players of these schemes are not many, and they are quite often recognizable in the market. There are funds promoters that obviously bring the products into the market. The red flags in connection to the funds promoters are pretty much the same all the time. They are funds promoter with no significant history. They are normally set up ad hoc to market a specific fund. They are registered in offshore jurisdiction where there are no record-keeping licensing requirements, external audit. So they're when you go and look at their business activity during the span life of the Ponzi scheme, for example, you will find no records, no client classification, no external compliance audit, and of course this is normally due to the fact that they are based in free zone areas or offshore jurisdiction with very low audit and compliance requirement. I mentioned there some of the upcoming are certainly free zones in the UAE, and new upcoming offshore jurisdiction like Mauritius or Seychelles. The funds promoters tend to establish a very close relationship with the independent financial advisor. That's one of the other recurring patterns in this type of schemes. Because of the lack of strong regulatory requirements and supervision and enforcement on the jurisdiction that I mentioned, it's very easy for fund promoters and independent financial advisors to sort of be too close, and this creates a number of issues, particularly when the intended nature of the fund structure is ab initio fraudulent or dubious at least. The other component of these schemes, and again for me, it is, and I consider it a regulatory arbitrage pattern that I consider actually a pink or sometimes a red flag, is the fact that a lot of these funds are included in the offer of life insurance, offshore wraps, or offshore funds platforms. Now, the terms and conditions of these life insurance and offshore wraps are normally extremely unbalanced. The investor funds are locked into life insurance bonds, offshore wraps for 5-10 years. The penalties for taking this money out are extremely high. They can go up to 50-70% of the total amounts invested. And the result is that while the investor knows that the money is locked into that sort of credible, reputable insurance scheme, during that period, all sorts of things happen, including churning of the accounts, rollovers, as you mentioned, and I can tell you is quite a serious situation. There's millions and millions of dollars in life insurance that are lost every year because of these boutique funds, as they are often defined, boutique shops or boutique funds. The truth is that there's nothing boutique there. It's mostly illiquid investments. Every time, every year, there's new type of investments. Every year, there's something new coming up. Is always an unregulated business. Is always a business that nobody understands, so it's almost impossible to price it. We know about agricultural investments, plots of land in third world countries, tech tree plantation in Sri Lanka. I mean, I didn't want to go too much. I will have another 100 of examples. But I think that I put here the most significant. Alternative energy investments, real estate funds, student accommodation funds. They just go down one after the other. And again, this session is basically on red flags and pink flags. Now, my view is that, I mean, I can recognize them because I investigate them or I just study them and I see the same people proposing them over and over again. They just change name and they change underlying asset or the name of the underlying asset, because in many cases there is no underlying asset because nobody goes and check whether there is a tech tree plantation in Sri Lanka or Mato Grosso. They go through external audit of the Big Four. Law firms draft their agreements and they get sold to everybody, and nobody sees it. So what can we do? The situation is, in my view, that who is best placed to and I had other slides. I know we don't have a lot of time, but while I see these as major red flags, at the end of the day, the institutions that are best placed to recognize on the back office, I would say, of these funds, the unusual patterns of these funds are, in fact, either the banks who are banking for these type of funds, or the insurance company who are hosting this type of funds, or the fund platforms that are launching and promoting these type of funds. because they see the flow of money, they can recognize suspicious patterns. The most easy to recognize are suspicious intercompany transfer that make no sense whatsoever. Irregular documentation, just unusual situations. For sure, it's not the investor that can look at it. So basically, I believe that these are just the new red flags. The regulatory arbitrage and the complexity of the structures, together with the way in which the funds are promoted into unregulated markets with poor regulatory frameworks, together with the probably the most important component, which is the assets, should become and should be seen by the big boys as the new red flags and should be recognized as such. And I believe that they will be recognized as such in upcoming third-party liability litigation in the future.
Thanks. And, you know, I would like to add, I mean, you know, I've been an investigative journalist for a long time, and it's, you know, I don't know whether you become cynical or you just, you know, have a better understanding of what goes on, and that understanding is sort of quite frightening, and you're not being cynical, you're just being realistic. The entire world of investing is incredibly seedy. You know, there is no such thing as, it seems to me these days, you know, I come across Mickey Mouse investment frauds which have major accounting firms signing off on audits, and as repeat attendees at this conference know, I like to name names, and you know, over the last 18 months, OffshoreAlert has exposed 2 litigation funding schemes, and the auditor, the auditing name, BDO, has appeared in both cases. Axium Legal Financing Fund in the Cayman Islands, and the Argentum Capital Centaur Group, which was in the Cayman Islands, the Channel Islands, and London. And, you know, when it comes to investing or providing services to the investment community, you can't rely on anyone to do due diligence for you. You can't rely on regulators. You know, I hear people say, well, you know, it's not my responsibility to do due diligence. I delegate it, you know, to somebody else. And they say it in the context of, you know, it's sort of beneath me. You know, that type of function is a menial function that I don't get involved with. But, you know, you cannot rely on anyone. You know, you have to do your own due diligence, no matter what your role is in any stage of it, whether you're the investor, you know, the service provider, the CEO of the service provider, you're in compliance for the service provider. You know, given the stakes, you know, you really need to do your own due diligence, and there is only one honest sales pitch in the investment world, and it's one that you will never see. And I have no idea, because if I was raising money from investors, my prospectus would just consist of this, and it would take up, you know, a fraction of one page. Your investment could go up, it could go down, or it could stay the same, and I don't know which of those 3 choices will occur. If I knew your investment would go up, why the hell am I telling you? I mean, it makes no sense. It defies common sense. And I've never seen a sales pitch like that. And you know, I've been doing investigative journalism for a long time, and you know, it's quite a depressing conclusion that it's just an incredibly seedy industry. I personally don't know why anyone would entrust another person with their money. It makes no sense. Why would you pay fees to somebody who almost certainly knows, you know, as little as you do? But of course, there wouldn't be an industry. You know, we'd all be out of jobs. I would be out of a job. I mean, you know, probably everybody here would be out of a job. So when it comes to providing services to the industry, you know, you should take a look at the marketing material because, you know, KYC databases, which everyone likes to use, they're only as good as the British libel system allows KYC databases to be. And by that I mean that in Britain and in British overseas territories and in former colonies, you know, people are frightened to death, often to talk the truth in a public forum, sometimes in a relatively private forum, much less publish information. So a lot is known about crooks that should be on KYC databases, but it isn't, because in British or a British-based libel system, if you get sued for libel by somebody who has money, you're going bankrupt. It's as simple as that. It's different in the US. You mentioned, James, IDIC. Well, IDIC is one of the many you know, companies, and I use that term loosely, that sued me for libel. And they actually sought an injunction against me at federal court in Miami. And this is one of the things I love about the United States. In Britain, that injunction would have automatically been given. The most Mickey Mouse fraudulent insurance company, you know, that's ever existed in the world, that was based in Grenada, which was a notorious, you know, criminal enterprise. You know, the private and public sectors got together. In Britain, they would have got an injunction. It probably would have been served on me at the 11th hour. I probably would have had to, you know, publish a blank page in OffshoreAlert, which at that time was distributed as a PDF file. In the US, they never even got a hearing. You know, basically, you know, the court said, you know, get lost. We're not even going to have a discussion about this. So you know, KYC databases are very limited. In fact, you know, the two major KYC databases are WillCheck and WillCompliance. I exposed WillCheck. It was set up by a guy called David Lepan. I mean, these are the KYC providers, and David Lepan falsely claimed to have had profiles of 18 of the 19 9/11 hijackers before the attacks took place. And, you know, journalists, who, in my experience, aren't the brightest bunch, and you could probably include me in that, they reported, you know, I can remember reading one story, if only the US government had access to this database, 9/11 could have been prevented. Well, the reality was, I went into the WillCheck system. Unfortunately for WillCheck at that time, they had a creation date for the profile. So what happened was that these profiles were created the very day that the names of the hijackers had been released by the US government. You know, and he was parlaying this up into, no, we already had them in the system, but he wasn't bright enough to even change the creation date. The other company, WillCompliance, I founded it. And it's now owned by LexisNexis. Nobody is above being the victim of fraud, and I mention this because I was swindled by my two partners in WillCompliance. These are the providers of the KYC databases. Scum. They increased the authorized share capital of the company without telling me. They awarded themselves shares without telling me. They did not put in any money for those shares. They claimed they were owed $1 million that had never appeared on the accounts that they were responsible for preparing. And then they notified me after the fact that I no longer owned 45%. I owned 25%. And, you know, this is all being recorded, by the way, so, you know, this is why I get sued a lot, you know. And we're going to put this out on YouTube, so. One of the things that I want to highlight is, you know, when I see somebody with an award, it doesn't impress me it is, a red flag. Maybe a peripheral red flag. So Dirk Moorman, one of the guys who cheated me in World Compliance, if you go to his LinkedIn profile, or certainly at that time, and I'm so anal about research that I've saved his LinkedIn profile every few months for probably 3 or 4 years. I've saved his LinkedIn profile so that, if I ever have to challenge him over this, he can't say, oh, somebody else does my profile, it was an innocent mistake. I can show that it's been there for years, and in that time his number of connections has gone up. He must have been visiting it on a regular basis. So he claimed on his LinkedIn profile, this is the CEO of a KYC database provider, probably the second biggest. It's now owned by LexisNexis. He claimed that he'd received an award from ACAMS, an ACAMS Technology Award. Well, ACAMS doesn't give out awards. This award has never existed. What happened was that World Compliance had a listing in the technology section of just like a telephone directory, if you like, right? And he just parlayed this up into an individual award for himself. And he also has on his LinkedIn profile, under sort of awards and honors, where are we here? That he was nominated for an integrity award by Transparency International. Well, this creates the impression that Transparency International have somehow nominated for an integrity award, no less. So I contacted Transparency International, and they were pretty furious with the way it was worded, that anyone can nominate anybody. You could nominate your cat, right? The actual nomination is meaningless. In this particular case, one of his own staff, he was the CEO of the company, one of his own staff had nominated him, and one can only guess who put him up to, suggesting that he be nominated for an award. In the context of Axium Legal Financing Fund, that had received, which was a litigation funding fraud, where pretty much 80% of the money raised went to the guy who'd set up the scheme. And it was supposed to go into funding third-party litigation. This is a latest sort of fad at the moment. It's very popular litigation funding, particularly in the UK, because I think they changed laws that, basically opened up this industry. It removed legal bars to financing, third-party litigation. Axiom Legal Financing Fund, its investment manager and its fund administrator all received awards from Hedge Week magazine. In the case of the investment manager, it had only been in legal existence as a company for 2 months. And it received an award. Now, it is Hedge Week. Hedge Week magazine is not some Mickey Mouse magazine. It's a bona fide, credible magazine. So, if somebody shows you a list of awards, it really, doesn't really mean much, if anything. A company called, this is a company with a sort of Cayman Islands twist, an American, Rani Jarkus, who's now banned from the US securities industry by FINRA, prior to shifting all of his corporate assets from California to the Cayman Islands, leaving behind a hopelessly bankrupt company with a ton of judgments against it for things like elder abuse. They specialized in defrauding their clients through churning and other mechanisms. His company in California received a compliance award from the Compliance Reporter, which again is a bona fide, credible publication. That seems to be well respected, and it just seems to be the magazine, from what I can understand, for the compliance industry. So, when I look at fraud, when I investigate fraud, things that are supposed to impress me have the opposite effect. And I'll give you another example. The British are obsessed with creating some sort of hierarchy. And one of the ways that this manifests itself is like giving people awards. Now, in Britain, some people, deserve awards, and I would say, Mr. Tim Ridley over there, OBE, is an example of that, right? But in many cases, they're just bought. Whether you get, Michael Ashcroft in Belize is an example of that. Lord Michael Ashcroft, the former deputy chairman, I think, of the Conservative Party. And, I know people who are investigating him, and it's quite eye-opening, the sort of allegations, unfounded, against this guy. And he's Lord Michael Ashcroft. And what, are we supposed to bow and scrape to this guy? After we exposed the Axium litigation fund, which a lot of attorneys were involved in, British attorneys, we turned around. I'm sort of going through these one by one, we exposed the Argentum group, and part of the group, and both of these raised in excess of $100 million. And the chairman of Argentum Capital Limited, which was a Channel Islands stock exchange, as it was then known. Yeah. He's a former London judge, a retired London judge. He's currently the deputy president of the civil and commercial courts in Qatar. Very respected. I went to his, they don't have law firms in Britain, they have chambers, And I went to the website. This is a Mickey Mouse fraud that's collapsed. It was delisted. The shares were suspended 3 days after we exposed it. The exchange waited for the weekend, and on the Monday they delisted it, so 5 days later. And on his chamber's website, before you even reached his name is David Keane. His name, the titles were the Right Honourable Sir, before his name even began. And he was the chairman of just the most dishonorable, disreputable, un-Sir-like, activity. And his group was, I think he was basically just a renter name. And that's something you have to bear in mind. If you come across, a website and, there's a private investigative company called Diligence, and I can remember going to their website and, seeing who was on their board of directors, and it was like, the ex-director of the CIA and their former head of the FBI and Lord so-and-so who used to be in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. And, this is, again, not impressive. It's designed to be impressive. It is a red flag. It's superficial, and it's actually a sign that money's being wasted. Because these people don't do anything, I mean, what the hell was Sir David, the Right Honourable Sir David Keane doing in this scheme that's collapsed? And one of the things I was going to say is, when it collapsed, they disconnected the phone lines, they dismantled their website, and apparently some of the directors have left their homes. I mean, this is the chairman. He has a former, London judge who is the deputy president of the, civil and commercial courts in Qatar. This isn't some homeless guy off the street. So, you cannot, trust anyone. Don't be impressed by anything other than, I would say, just more important than the backgrounds of the individuals, because, there's a first time for everything, right? Every fraudster had a clean background at some stage. Just look at the way it's being marketed. So, given that, in my opinion, the honest sales pitches could go up or down or stay the same, and I have no idea, what's going to happen, right? And you never see that. So, if you accept that as true, by definition, every single investment scheme that's marketed, is not honest. Now, in terms of liability, okay, there probably isn't a requirement to be, totally honest. The liability probably kicks in somewhere along the line where, slightly to the dishonest side of the sort of gray area, where you're making material omissions or you're just, you're just lying about something outright, but, and then, I mentioned this last year during my presentation where, you should always be particularly wary of anyone who's in the business of raising money and their entire companies and their group is named after themselves. Because, what does common sense tell you? That this is somebody who has a big ego. Now, law firms are named after individuals, but they're not out there soliciting investments, so it's a sort of different scenario. But, you look at Bernard Madoff. His company was, what was it, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. Look at Alan Stanford, the Stanford Group, Stanford International Bank, Stanford Trust Company. And going back a few years for the crinklies among us, Robert Maxwell, the Maxwell Foundation. Maxwell this, Maxwell that, and that guy was a big crook who was never held accountable. This is another thing that the British specialise in is they're great at holding people accountable after they've died. So you're getting it with Jimmy Savile at the moment in the UK. It was the same with Robert Maxwell, where he was stealing, the pension funds of his group. In the case of Axium Legal Financing Fund, the perpetrator, who's suing me for libel in London, which is a bastion of injustice, the London High Court. Timothy Schools, former British policeman, currently retrained as a solicitor, in the process of trying to stave off being struck off the solicitor's role. But his, the investment management company that he set up, which received an award from, Hedge Week, was called Tangerine Investment Management, which, an acronym of which is TIM. This guy's law firm that he set up was called, or one of them, ATM Solicitors. He called it ATM Solicitors, a British company, because he treated it as a cash cow. It's basically, he used to stick his card in, so to speak, and out would pop, instead of, the $300 limit a day that us minions are faced with, he would get millions a day. So, you can tell a lot. This is sort of the subtle area of red flags. That isn't something you would, typically look upon with suspicion. But in my experience, if you think I have any credibility as a person, you should take it and look out for it in whatever you do, whether you're considering investing money or not.
And David, you just used a word that I had written down to comment on, and it's credibility. And I think a lot of these, you look at investment programs and Ponzi schemes. What do they want? Well, they want your money, but what do they need to get that is they need credibility. And a lot of these red flags are, whether it's complexity or a successful history, it all goes toward building their credibility, and that's you hit on it right there.
Yeah. So basically anyone who's offering, any sort of guaranteed returns, the guarantee's worthless. Anyone who shows you a track record that, it's pretty much a diagonal line. They might even, I was going to say the clever of them, but in reality, the less stupid. Because it's a common myth, in my opinion, fraudsters are particularly bright. Not in my experience, but you only have to be less stupid than the person you're asking for money. And so some of them will throw in some deviation, right? Just a token effort to throw you off the trail, right? It's, my purported returns, they're not, I've got to be careful doing this. It's not a diagonal line, it might sort of be more like this, Yeah, that's, you know. But, you know, I look at investment magazines, and every year they have the photograph of a different person, hedge fund manager of the year, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, anyone can have a lucky year, you know, anyone. But, you know, anyone who claims to make consistently high returns is either lying, right, or if the returns are genuine, it's from doing something illegal. And it doesn't matter whether it's George Soros, who, by the way, has a criminal conviction in France for insider trading. And do you know what his hefty punishment was? He had to repay his profits back. I mean, man, you know, I bet that stopped him from doing it again. It doesn't matter who it is. Nobody knows what the hell is going to happen when it comes to investing. So if you're a professional service provider, you know, you really need to just, you know, to protect yourself, because, you know, you're going to end up paying if you're not too careful. Just, you know, make sure you read the marketing material and there isn't really anything too funky there. So that's it. Do we have any questions? Okay, well, thanks, Carlo, and thanks. Oh, do we have a question here?
Why don't any of these guys go to jail?
Well, you know, well, right, the question was, why don't any of these guys go to jail? Well, obviously, some of them go to jail, but I think probably the question is, why do most of them not go to jail? And, you know, quite frankly, to devote the resources to this, everybody's taxes would have to go up, you know, to like, you know, 90%, because it's so prevalent. You know, human beings have a propensity, you know, to dishonesty, you know, in varying degrees. In fact, you know, I'm sure, given the right set of circumstances, we're all capable of being dishonest, you know, me included. You know, you might have access to somebody else's money. You might have a child, a relative, that needs an operation or they're going to die. Who wouldn't resist? You know, when you prioritize, you know, who wouldn't resist the temptation to take some money over here to save, you know, your relative's life? And you might have the intention of paying it back. You know, so we're all capable of it. And you know, I did say in my opening this morning, you know, the intention wasn't to moralize. But, you know, I think that the important thing is to realize that, you know, we're each on our own here. You know, you can't really rely on anyone to protect your reputation, you know, to protect your assets. So I personally, and this probably isn't popular among anyone who relies on this for a living, but I personally would never give a dime of my money to somebody else to manage. Unless I had so much money that I just, you know, didn't have the time. I needed just really an administrator. You know. So that's it.